Hey everyone, it's Marvin. If you think the US needs better representation for minorities, especially during this election season, then you should check out The Future of Our Former Democracy, the chart-topping history podcast from More Equitable Democracy and Large Media. Each week on The Future of Our Former Democracy, hosts George Chung and Colin Cole dive into what our democracy could look like if we left behind our current winner-take-all model and embraced a fairer, more proportional system. If you need somewhere to start on this podcast, I recommend listening to the first episode where George discusses how his identity as a queer Asian American fueled his activism and commitment to social justice. Follow The Future of Our Former Democracy wherever you get your podcasts. Hey everyone, it's Marvin. Just wanted to make a quick note that this episode was recorded several days before this week's election. And so just in case you're wondering why we're not bringing up certain things that happened this week, obviously we're not feeling great about what happened. And we hope that all of you listening are doing well. Hopefully our discussion will bring some much needed levity and good vibes to your day. It is my sincerest hope that that's something we can provide for you all. And for those of you looking for some resources, either to make sense of what's happening or to look for ways to get yourself engaged and take more action, I have included some resources in our show notes. So please check them out if you do feel so inclined. And please, please, please remember to take care of yourself, take care of those around you, and we'll get through this together. Thank you so much for tuning into Books and Boba, and please enjoy our show.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And welcome to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here today with an author chat with Nayantara Roy about her debut novel, The Magnificent Ruins. As always, Books and Boba is supported in part by our listeners. So if you've been enjoying what we've been putting out and want to become a bigger part of our book club, you can head on over to patreon.com/booksandboba, where as an official Patreon supporter, you gain access to our members-only Discord server, as well as bonus podcasts and the ability to help us choose a quarterly book club pick.
Yeah, and we had a great chat with Tara, about like her background as a development exec and how that was a transition for her as an author. We talked about multi-generational families and the inherited traumas from those families and what it means to be caught between identities as a diasporan. So a lot of great talk.
Yeah, and we also talked to her about the experience of writing such a sprawling story. So, please enjoy our conversation with Tara Roy.
And we are here with Nayantara Roy, author, playwright, and television executive at Starz Lionsgate. She is a 2020 alumni of the CAPE Leaders Program and is a jury member of the Starz Take the Lead Directors Program. And we are here to talk about her debut novel, The Magnificent Ruins, which releases on November 12th. Welcome to the show, Tara.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we like to start our show with a little icebreaker to get us into the conversation. So you work in television and you're also an author. And your main character in Magnificent Ruins, Lila, works in the publishing world as an editor. So my icebreaker question to you is, what is a book-to-screen adaptation you've enjoyed?
I'd say Normal People.
Normal People, yeah.
I was also at fifth season at the time that they were making that show and had a little bit of insider status on that show. So I think I saw the way the book transformed, but I also, in the final viewing as an audience, was just struck by how it really came to life as its own thing in a different medium. I think that's where book to film really succeeds, when it's its own thing, very much off the medium that it's meant for.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always like that balance where you want to You want the people who love the book to be happy with it, but you also want it to like, not just be constrained in like a one-to-one type of thing. I imagine it's really hard for everyone involved to like kind of strike that balance. But yeah, I mean, we'd love to start off our author chats by learning more about our authors' backgrounds, and you have just such a storied background, I guess. It's an open-ended question, but how would you describe your author's journey to becoming a novelist?
I was born in India into an English language speaking family in Bengal. And the context around that is, we spoke in English, we thought in English. We are very much the remnants of colonization, very westernized family. But on my mother's side, also deeply rooted in the traditional culture. Both my mother and father were voracious readers. My cousin is a novelist. My grandaunt was a novelist. My mother is a teacher. I grew up around literature. She, I think, specifically, just had a lot of classics that I read very early. And then from my dad's bookshelves, I was able to pick up pulp and action, and my grandma's, Jackie Collins. And all of this contributed to, I think, me just very early on in school and high school, winning prizes and having that. I was the editor of my school magazine. What happened, though, in college was, sort of my Asian family kind of being like, being a novelist isn't, a steady gig. Maybe think about something else. And so film and TV really seemed to appeal to me because I loved storytelling. I had messed around in the theater a little bit in Bombay. And I had written plays that had gone on to be performed in the US and the UK. And so what ended up happening was that I went to college and grad school for a career that I eventually have found a lot of success in. But the novelist bone doesn't leave you easily. And so through that whole time period, across continents, I've always been writing. I wrote that short story that won me that prize. I've been writing articles. In graduate school at Columbia University, took a class called Other People's Secrets with the fiction writing students, not the screenwriting students. And what emerged was an essay about a mother and daughter that became the genesis for my book.
That's interesting. I mean, the story of, parents wanting you to have a stable career away from the arts is like a classic Asian American, Asian diaspora immigrant story. But the fact that like they weren't okay with being a novelist, but they were okay with film, TV, and the stage.
I mean, they're familiar with literature, so it's like they have like that insider knowledge of, like being a novelist is tough. I mean, if you're going to be a writer, then TV film is a more practical route to go in.
Well, I will say my father, up until maybe 10 years ago, kept asking my sister what it is specifically my job was. And it's only now, I think, he's been to my office and I work a very 9-to-5 job in the same way that he did for, the 50 years of his career or whatever it was. And he has seen my 401k and my, these are the things that are familiar to my parents, the structures that seem reassuring to them. And so, that's where it's been helpful. I wouldn't say it's been like, great going, go get yourself a film and TV degree. They would have preferred me to be a doctor. That's for sure.
I'm sure that's every parent's dream, whether they're Asian or not. They want their child to be a doctor. As someone who works in like the entertainment industry and in like a creative field, how do you go from like switching from development executive to like writing your own stories? Do you think your day job helps you when it comes to writing your own stories?
It's a great question. I'm just going to say one thing. My dad is my biggest fan right now, and after retiring has really sort of taken it upon himself to be my literary manager.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
This is how you should, invest this money. And for the next book, you should maybe publicize it. Like, I'm like, okay, great. Listen, I'm a baby novelist and a pretty seasoned television executive, right? So I approach the two things with very, very different levels of confidence, right? I do think where the twain meet is your gut instinct, right? I've spent a lot of time around story and creative. My job is to buy concepts, whether it's whether it's in the form of IP like books or a play or a fully packaged script, and then shepherd it across creative development with the writers, right? That gut feeling of, what makes story work when it's working, it's such a different medium, and one that I have confidence in. I mean, television, but it's only, I think, the instinct of what makes it work. I've been able to replicate that in literature. There's this point, especially my debut, it was so sprawling and had so many structural pieces and so ill-advised for a debut novelist to do, to break with form and tradition as much. And there were many moments in my gut when I just went with instinct versus wisdom.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised that this was your debut novel because just like reading the book jacket description and also just like holding it, I was like, oh, this is like a hefty book with a lot of like very heavy topics too. So for our listeners out there, do you think you can give us a short summary of your book?
Yeah, of course. The Magnificent Ruins follows Lila. She is a millennial books editor in Brooklyn who makes complex choices like most millennials about love, career, her family. She is very much American in the sense that she has been so for about 15 years since she's moved from Calcutta. In that time period, she also has not seen her mother. One day, Lila wakes up to find that her maternal grandfather is dead. And this is a blow enough as is. But she also finds out that she has inherited the family's ancestral property in Kolkata. This is seemingly wonderful news, but the catch is that Lila's mother, grandmother, and a whole host of relatives still live in the property and are very ready to embrace her in the way Asian families will, but very ready to also contest the inheritance. So when Lila goes back, she, inherits a lot more than just the house. It's all of these relationships, and the book is fairly, it excavates the territory of secrets that have lain buried for many years.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, I'm at the age where either myself or friends, like, we have grandparents pass away, and there's, what I've found is a lot of family drama occurs during talks of inheritance, who gets what, especially in Asian families when like the eldest son usually dictates who gets what. And, depending on your relationship, there's just so much like potential for drama here. So it's really cool to see this. I don't know if it's a uniquely Asian thing, but definitely like the fact that Asian families are so patriarchal and so conservative doesn't help. And to see the drama on the page was really cool.
Well, thanks for that. That's actually something no one talks about. I mean, a big thing in the book is, and thank you for noticing that, is that Lila's mother feels very sidelined, that it wasn't left to her. And Lila's grandmother feels that it should have gone to the eldest son of the family versus Lila. Her mom is nowhere even in the mix, and her mom is, pretty rightfully has all the qualifications to run the family business. And the structure of a joint family is, very sprawling, and it's power and agency that doesn't just have to do with money in the house, though it is that too. It has to do with who leads the family, who makes decisions, and that kind of power, which tends to rest in the patriarchy.
And also, I feel like multi-generational houses, like they're pretty rare here in the West. So that adds another complication of, well, you become my landlord, and you haven't really been part of this family for quite a while. So to just come in and, now you're the owner of the place that I live in, that's a little bit, it's a hard pill to swallow, especially since Lila is so young.
And where I really connect with Lila is that, she's got a nuclear family. Like my dad sometimes comes and visits me, but for the most part, I see him once every couple of months. And he lives in India, so it's a bit of a trek. And, when I was single, I lived alone. And now I live with my partner and a dog. And these are very nuclear structures. Now, put that in a 5-story building with a family on every floor, each of whom, and there's no doors, or, metaphorically, there's no privacy. It's interesting, and I grew up around a lot of it.
Yeah, the whole privacy part. I was like, oh my God, I can totally see why Lila would not want to stay at that house and rather like stay at her father's apartment, which is like a street over. Privacy is a luxury in these kinds of situations. Mm-hmm. You said that you began writing the Magnificent Ruins in your class, and I'm wondering like when that was, and do you remember the first scene, or I guess first character voice that came to you?
It's a great question. No one's quite ever asked me quite like that. So the Genesis essay came about in Benjamin Taylor's class, Other People's Secrets. Just by the nature of that title of the class, you know that it was territory where we read authors who were talking about family secrets, not necessarily their own, but the power and agency of a secret. The essay is separate from the book. It shares some DNA with the broader structure of the relationship between Lila and her mother. But the essay, funnily enough, it's going to be published later this year. But the essay was its own thing. Benjamin Taylor really read the essay and had feelings about it that I had never quite had a professional talk to me in that way. And he was like, well, you're a writer, and I held that with me as I got this other degree. And I think the first time I put pen to paper was the third year of graduate school, where, you're teaching a little bit, but your classes have pretty much petered out. And I was like, let me just see. I have time this year. And it ended up being 50 rambling sort of pages of stream of consciousness. And then slowly, I began putting it together, and I worked with an author friend. Well, initially I showed it to him, and I was like, this is nothing, right? He did not think it was nothing. And, it took a lot of validation and understanding structure, and the fact that I was an avid reader helped. But, there were building blocks along the way.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talked about earlier that, you relied on your instinct as like, as a, entertainment executive while you're writing your book, because like reading your novel really reminded me of like watching an indie film, especially in like how it just felt so deliberately paced. And you really get a sense of like your settings, your situations, and especially where Lila stands in regards to them. Can you tell us a little bit about how you how did you come up with the, narrative outline of the story? Like, did you use any of your like TV film frameworks for that, or how did you come up with that?
The subconscious is a powerful thing, right? It's working with you in whichever medium you're trying to tell a story. And so what you've learned from one, you will carry, sometimes to your detriment and other times to your advantage, into the other. I was certainly very conscious of having too much knowledge in the film and TV medium, and I did not want to, write in that manner. But I've turned to other authors, on the page and in real life to offer me advice. I listen to a ton of literary podcasts, yours included. I think the moment it really transformed from rambling to structure was when my author friend Sunil Yapa, who was reading it, was like, what about an outline at this point? I was like, oh, I see. Building blocks. And I've never strayed from it since. Even if I write an essay now, I outline it. But I think I made that outline over a period of 6 weeks or so. I remember I was in Mount Shasta or something, somewhere up Northern California, and it was beautiful. And I just had time, and I was looking at this river, and I, that there's a final sort of death in the book. And I remember that clicking into place while I was watching that river. And it was really remarkable because, yes, I strayed from the outline many times. The book itself, when you're writing something, it springs to life in its own way. But the bones of it have kind of remained the same. And I am a big proponent of the theory of outline.
So your book is set in 2015, and that's like a year before a lot of things change here in America. And of course, like in India, there was some political conflicts that were happening. Do you think the story would have been different if you had set it in present day?
It's definitely something, when my agent first started reading it, she told me, I was like, why isn't this set in present day? Because the political situation in India has not changed dramatically since then. Well, I would say it has intensified in many ways. But she was like, why not set it in present day setting? And then there's this line where Lila's ex-boyfriend turns to her and says something to the effect of, you operate with the assurance of an American in the Obama years. And I think that's really why I did that. I think Lila has a cockiness to her, a self-assuredness that democracy is mine to have. I am an American citizen. What could go wrong? And there's this sense when she goes to India that there's this distance. She deeply cares, I think, but there's this distance where she thinks that could never happen to me. That could never happen to the country that I live in. And her ex-boyfriend rightly calls her out on it because she belongs to both worlds. And there's this sense of being caught between the two.
Yeah, I cannot believe that 2015 was like almost 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're recording this episode literally like days before the 2024 election. So it might be, we'll see what kind of world our listeners are in when they're listening to our conversation. But yeah, it's definitely interesting how much things can change and how we can see that and read that in when stories take place now, like, stories pre-pandemic, stories pre-2016. Like, it's just such like
it's an era.
Our recent history has become like period settings now, and that's always interesting.
And a literary fiction author was sort of talking about, if you're going to set something in present day, you're having to take into account massive tectonic shifts in the way we operate. And that is why Lila can have sort of this, this arrogance of the West, and that has been shaken, right? I mean, 2 days before that election in 2016, I was cocky, right? So there's that piece of it. And then, in writing my second book, I was very conscious about writing present day. And it is extremely hard to write in the present day without taking, you may not be writing a political book, but it is impossible. You're a person in the world, and the political is so deep, and so is disease and the way we wash our hands today. And all of that it's a different world. Yeah.
I mean, even your book is full of political musings and situations. And one of the things that I really enjoyed was that you spent a lot of time in your writing giving context to the situation and settings that Lila finds herself in. As a reader, we learn about not only her family's internal politics, but also the then current political situation in India, as well as even like what it's like to be working for an indie publisher who gets acquired by a big corporation. Can you tell us a little bit how you balanced all that, giving context to the setting while also making sure that the plot kept moving?
I have a wonderful editor in Kathy Porys. And she, I think, is just very nimble and able to spot the difference between what illuminates versus what weighs something down, right? And I had that luxury. But I will say it was important for me to take the time to get to know. In an ensemble, it's really hard to get to know folks, and you do have to give the room and the space for them to come alive and what their daily realities are. The book definitely talks about the political situation in India, but insofar as it affects the family, in the ways they gossip about it, in the ways they are arrogant about it, in the ways each character is sort of defined by their leanings, in the ways the family has experienced post-colonial ancestral trust funds, So I would say that it's a combination of having had excellent help and strictly defining it to these characters versus going broader out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely never weighs the story down. I was just always amazed at how much context I was getting and how interesting it was, especially in this day and age of big corporate interests taking over a lot of the arts and media space, right? So it's still relevant even in 2024.
Well, fun fact, my publisher was acquired right before they signed on for my book by a bigger publishing house. And, my editor had a very deep understanding by the time that she was editing the book of what Lila was going through. And so it was a fun little meta process of her being like, oh, absolutely. And maybe not this piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe editing your book was also therapy for her. Yeah.
I mean, it's everywhere right now. Film, TV, and mergers and acquisitions and publishing, they are the norm.
Yeah. You, like Marvin said, you give so much context in the book, political and also with capitalism, acquisition. But the heart of your novel is family, and it specifically focuses on the strained relationship between Lila and her mother. And, there is love, but it's also mixed in with emotional manipulation, jealousy, and, mental health issues. What was the trickiest part of writing this very fraught mother-daughter relationship?
Yeah, and I would say that you've hit upon it, right? It's three women, and they're all mothers and daughters, right? And the ways in which they're interconnected, their dynamics with each other. I would say the trickiest part was, that there were no easy villains, to make sure that each person had agency, and that, because the book is set so heavily in Lila's POV, that there wasn't the sense that, oh, she's our protagonist and we will find her redemption, but the other characters are really just going to be in a person's POV. I would like to say that the book fairly dissects why the women behave in the way they do and the reasons. I think everyone's gray. There's no black and white. And it wasn't hard because I personally wanted to write about generational trauma in that sense, and cultures of silence around violence in South Asian families. But I definitely wanted to trace what creates the pattern versus blame it on any one thing.
So, I feel like I read this book right on time. I'm a millennial who has had a strained relationship with my mother, but I'm also at that age where I can recognize that my mother was also a person and a young woman who didn't really know what she was doing. And it made me question, is it possible for children to have compassion for their parents while holding them accountable for the abuse that they inflicted? And how did you explore that idea through Lila's POV?
When I first started writing it, it was so interesting because I talked about sort of the patterns of violence and emotional manipulation with, cousins and so on. And it was right after that class, after I'd written that essay. And it was a sense of, this is so normal. You're making a big deal. And you're probably making a big deal because you've gone to America. But, my cousins over the UK and, they too were sort of blasé about it. And I had never spoken of it myself. And so there was this deep desire to write about the silence itself, that was important. But as I was writing it, you'll notice that Lila does not have compassion so much as this bone deep grief, for her mom. There's anger. It's all unresolved, right? I mean, there's anger, but there's this sort of sadness that surrounds them. I think, therapy and under really putting yourself in your mom's shoes, like you may have, Rira, or that certainly happened to me, where there is this, as you grow older, understanding that my circumstances were different. I have all this luxury. I certainly consider myself very privileged to have the resources of mental health and people talking to me and literature and living in 2024 where we can freely talk about this. I know that generations above me have not had that. In fact, it's been shameful, and mental health it continues to be, even though things have improved greatly, continues to be in India a source of shame. I have family members who are like, it feels tough to go to a therapist. It feels like admitting to a flaw. And that's not the case when we go to a dentist. So, why would it be any different flossing your brain,
Flossing your brain, that is a great term. Yeah, like I feel like you said, we are the generation that has like all the accessibility to mental health. And in the beginning of your book, you do mention like, oh, Indians, they think therapy is like failure and they don't invest in failure. And I was like, oh, wow, this is a very familiar concept that I'm used to. And the definition of abuse can vary across cultures and also like social norms. Like the abuse that we see here in America might not be accepted as abuse in India or in Asia. And it affects the way we see love and how we accept it. Can you tell us more about how Lila's view on love differs when she is in India as opposed to when she is in New York?
I think that might be the smartest question anyone's ever asked me about the book.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a little taken aback by it, frankly. That's exactly it, right? What you would call social services for in this country, in the US where I currently live, is the norm in India. And I'm not saying across every family, but for the most part, especially in the era that I was a child. And what is discipline to one family or to one culture is, absolutely unacceptable. And I think Lila, like a lot of millennial immigrants, is in a country that was unacceptable and is realizing that after the fact. And that is huge and has created all of this upset within her, but she has to confront it when she goes back because, as you rightly point out, the love is very much a real and burning bridge between the three women. And as she slowly understands that she's not willing anymore to accept that was good for her, that was love, she's pretty willing to say, you did this by the end of the book, I don't think it gives anything away to say that there's plot, but I think closure is the biggest thing that the three women embrace, in different ways. And that is incredible because they are in such different mental spaces. I would even say Maya and Geeta, who live in the same house and occupy the same culture, just being two generations apart, the mother and the grandmother, that's a total ideology shift. And I think if we were to meet Lila 10 years later with a child, I have no plans of meeting Lila 10 years later with a child, but if we were to, the ways in which she would interact with her child would be different. And that is really what the book hopes for, I think.
Yeah, with each generation, we're not aiming for it's fine. We want our children to be happy and healthy and thrive, just oh, it was fine. I turned out fine. It's like, that's not the goal here.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of love, there is some romance or rather romantic drama in your novel as well. And I like that it didn't necessarily become the focus, like that finding romantic love isn't the thing that saves Lila in the end. But I did like the chapters following, like there's an inadvertent love triangle in your story that she finds herself in. And, again, your writing does a really good job invoking her feelings for the readers. But I was wondering, was it hard not to just say, okay, this is a romance now. It's gonna be about this grand gesture that one of your characters makes.
I remember when I was writing it and I mentioned to this male novelist friend that I was thinking about this, love triangle. He was like, that's ridiculous. You don't need a romance. And he might have been right, but the truth is that Lila's at that age and stage where unless as a conscious choice, she's actively practicing celibacy. Some preoccupation with love and romance and sex is going to present itself in some form or shape, right? And if she's actively pursuing being single, then, the context of that. And I think we meet her in a very airy-fairy the gray territory that almost every, 20-something person who has access to, bars and apps and social settings where you meet someone, she has that. And she has all of the, it's complicated as well, in her life that millennials do. And I think when Lila goes back, because the book is so centered around the theme of choice, right, between East and West, it is inevitable that she finds that presenting itself in her personal life, right? That there is a man who's attractive to her that from her past, and there are reasons why he is attractive. And a lot of those reasons have to do with culture and some have to do with their history. But there's also a man who is interesting to her, who is American. And that is natural because she is American.
Yeah, something I found pretty intriguing was how the Lahiri family, they refer to Lila as an American. And I just thought that was interesting because she grew up in India until she was a teenager, until she was 16. That's more than half her life. And it really made me question, like, who gets to decide whether we are like Indian enough or American enough? How did you go about crafting Lila's diaspora identity, and how much of your own experience did you pour into her?
Yeah. When I first moved to the US, I remember some family members saying to me, and it was political, I was very deeply political. I remain deeply political, but some family members saying to me on a phone call, "You're not going to get that. You're American." I'm like, I just moved here. What do you mean? What are you talking about? But I think the more complex answer to your question lies in, the reasons we code switch, the reasons our accents shift, the reasons our thinking shifts, the reason we have we are exposed to different cultures and sometimes more democratic ones, as I was, in graduate school and college settings, and deeper understandings of our own cultures result, from those settings. I think the fact that she is in the US at that tender age where you're trying to fit in so hard, that definitely shaped a lot of her. Lila feels American, but it is also a cozy little cover for her because in Lila's case, specifically, being Indian was a dangerous place to be. But she's never processed it quite like that. And I think by the end of the book, Lila understands that she is very deeply Indian, and that is an identity she can safely assume. And being American is there for her taking. She can be as American as she wants to be or feels like, but it isn't necessarily something she has to hide behind.
Yeah, I mean, she knows the language. And, when her family members are like, you don't understand the political conflict that this country is going through. And it's like, I mean, they are true to a certain extent. It's like, she might be aware, but she's not living that reality. She's been living in America, and that's vastly different from the people who have been living under that situation.
Also, America in 2015. So she's, we're about to get our own taste of it too, right?
Yeah, we were in our unicorn era. Like, we really believe that we were living in a better world, a better diverse world. And it's like, oh no, like, it can be taken away from us at any second. There's no security.
There was a complacency, I think, to myself, in those 8 years and the lead up to it. But it's also a complacency in the way elections run. I'll say this much. The Obama-Romney election is very different from the ones that we have had since, and I think that's where Lila's coming from, that two parties with reasonably decent decency being the protocol, and everybody's talking to everybody and dialogue is possible, and it is possible to be friends with differing opinions. This is a complacency, a luxury, a privilege, and certainly not where we went or where the book goes.
Yeah. What happened to decency? Yeah, that is like the bar is hell.
We need someone to write that book.
Yeah. Like I do want to mention like the Lahiri household. Like the house is just its own character in its way, like with this secret terrace and the multiple floors where families are hiding secrets, even though, there's no privacy. Like that is quite an amazing feat. How did you come up with the blueprint for the house? Did you did you have like research references and did you have to like go into the history of like what houses back then looked like?
So the zamindari houses of Calcutta are very familiar to me. There's a house in my own family that's very similar. And then I had friends who lived in homes like that. And in my 20s, made a short film for school that really took place in the even older, more grand sort of zamindari post-colonial houses. And these were the homes where the landowning classes lived, right? These were the folks that the British looked at and were like, let's make these brown people exactly like white people so that we'll have a bridge to the peasants and to the classes, right? So these were families that spoke in English and sort of had a little bit of blood on their hands because they certainly thought themselves better than the regular folks who, especially the classes that worked for them, right? It was very easy for me, just given the fact that there was a home in my own family like that. And actually, as my uncle educated me, my paternal uncle, we have had a few homes. And so my own ancestry is dubious. And then I had done all this research in Calcutta for that film, but also grown up there. So it was so easy. I knew that house like the back of my hand.
Yeah, and it definitely comes through in your writing. And I felt like Gothic vibes. And, like in literature, it's like, oh, we've seen like spooky, decaying houses that have seen better days when the rich were rich just from collecting taxes from the poor. And it's like, it was like familiar, but also a different, like, it's like, okay, yeah, like a different setting, different vibes. But
yeah, I mean, the house was big and complex, and the family itself was also big and complex. Like, it definitely reminded me of like old money families that we see in like literature and media, stuck in their ways elders who have lost touch with modernity. A big part of a big plot point of your book is the installation of like an elevator system in this giant house. Can you tell us a little bit how you created this family and their relationships? Because, I was very thankful actually for the family tree. Like whenever there's a family tree for these these sprawling family epics, I'm like, oh, now I know who's related to who. But there's a lot of half siblings. There's twin uncles. There's
age
nephews
gaps,
and cousins. Yeah. How was that process for you to like create this family?
It's interesting because in any one of these joint families, there are going to be 3 or 4 times the number of characters that you do see in the Lahiri family, right? And I started there. I initially, I think back in the first few rambling pre-outline days, I was like, well, there's got to be, it's not real if it isn't. And I've quickly realized that this was going to have to be the most compressed version if it was going to tell the story that I wanted to tell. obviously my understanding of these old families is fairly intensive. So I knew that there would have to be a matriarch, a patriarch. Were they going to be dead? Likely, yes, for my story. I knew that the central force, the through line, was going to have to be these three women. And I knew who the villains and heroes were going to be outside of that, right? So then it's really making a decision. Okay, I've conflated and compressed many different people I've met in the duration of my life. People who I've met once, some people who I've met 1,000 times, and taken characteristics and invented things. How does it all then become linear into just a few folks? And the word that is used most often is sprawling. Rebecca is invoked often, the novel Rebecca, in terms of the Gothic quality of the house. It is not an easy task. And I too turned to that family tree often to, make sure those relationships were correct.
It's like a lot of Asian families because it's like you have cousins who are like older than you, uncles who are the same age as you. It does get quite complicated, and that relationship dynamic is like, well, technically my position in the family is higher than you, but because you're older than me, then like, what are we going to do?
Exactly. I also did have, and I really encourage writers to, well, I don't know if I want to give advice, but I'll say what benefited me was having fellow authors to talk to. I had a great editorial agent, and the difference between someone taking your book out to just sell it versus someone who loves the book and has thoughts and opinions. My agent, Emma, really has been with me from the start and has shaped the narratives with me, in giving at least a couple of rounds of notes. And that's just, that's helped so much because those are outsider perspectives on purely the fiction of it, on the rigorous literary craft of it, whereas you've got all this advantage of knowing what is real, but also knowing and what feels true, but also knowing too much almost.
We are winding down to the end of our interview. This has been such an insightful conversation. You mentioned earlier that you were working on a second book. Is there, are you allowed to tell us a little about it?
It's finished, and I believe it will see the light of the day, is all I can say. But it's in those conversations right now. It is a story about half siblings. I find family fascinating, but I find blended family even more fascinating. And I have a blended family. It's curious because half siblings don't fully belong to each other, and yet they try to belong to each other in many ways. But there's a level of politeness and a level of distance as well. And I wanted to explore that relationship through the lens of two sisters and some extraordinary secrets that they carry. I love a good secret.
Yeah. There's your main character Lila also has half siblings, and I distinctly remember a line in the early chapters where she mentions that it took her a year to learn to love her sister, and I think it's cool that because her American side is not something that we explore a lot in this book, so it's kind of cool to see maybe this is like a follow up to those struggles. So looking forward to hopefully we'll be able to catch the publishing announcement on our podcast sometime soon. But congratulations on completing your second book.
That's
you.
Big accomplishment.
Yeah. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us on Books and Boba. Congratulations on the publishing of your debut novel. And yeah, best of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much. It was such a wonderful conversation. This was really fun.
And that was Nayantara Roy. Her debut novel, The Magnificent Ruins, goes on sale next week on November 12th and will be available at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookshop. Before we go, Reera, can you remind us what we're reading for book club this month?
Yeah, so we are reading Marvin's Pick, Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. And it is a meta book that is kind of similar to the book that we read for book club in our early days, How to Survive in a Science Fictional Universe, also by Charles Yu. And it explores, racial stereotyping in Hollywood, generic Asian man tropes in film, The Hulu show is coming out at the end of November, so that's going to be fun, reading the book and then comparing it to the TV show.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the impetus of me choosing this book because, it's been on our to-read list for a long time, right? So it's won a couple awards. A lot of people, it's been a book that has crossed into mainstream consciousness, and we were like, we should read it at some point. And now it's like, oh no, the TV show is coming out. We should probably read it before we watch the TV show because, as we know on this podcast, I'm trying not to be the guy who has only seen the adaptation version of things. So this is my effort into being a better person,
being a better person. I just remember you watch Pachinko and you're like, oh, the book is so much better. And I'm like, now you know how it feels because usually I am team book. And a lot of the times people are like, well, I thought it was good without knowing the context of what it could have been. So
yeah, but now I'm cursed with knowledge, and I'm okay with that.
You're okay with that. Yeah, you better be okay with that. You run a book club podcast. Better be team book.
So if you are reading along with us on Discord, please continue to share your thoughts. It's been a lot of fun discussing these books with book club members in real time. And for those of you who aren't Patreon supporters, you can also tell us your thoughts about the book by going to our Goodreads forums. As always, we'd love to include your feedback on our podcast discussions whenever possible. So yeah, with that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thanks once again to Tara Roy for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey Candace, we are so excited to have you join me and Kathy for a brand new season of the Korean Drama Podcast, the podcast about watching Korean dramas by people who don't watch Korean dramas.
I'm so excited to join the podcast, but where's Kathy? She said she'd meet us here.
Candace, I'm right here.
Why is Kathy's voice coming from this chicken meatball?
So, funny story. I was so busy watching Korean dramas on my phone to prepare for this podcast that I accidentally walked into a mysterious machine and got turned into food. And, excuse me, Kim, I'm obviously a chicken nugget.
Agree to disagree.
Well, that's a weird coincidence because for our 5th season of the Korean Drama Podcast, we're watching the comedy sci-fi series Chicken Nugget.
Join us each week as we discuss the highs and lows of Chicken Nugget episode by episode.
So grab a snack, maybe not chicken nuggets, and follow us on your favorite podcast app, part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.
You're totally going to eat me, aren't you?